Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for this HHS Office of Research Integrity Technical Assistance webinar for ensuring research integrity conferences funding opportunity. My name is Karen Wayner, and I'm with the Office of Research Integrity. I'm joined today by Mr. Dwayne Barlow, Grants Management Branch Chief in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. Next slide, please. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All participants have been muted. We invite you to submit questions throughout the webinar in the chat. Please ensure that you select the option to send your questions to all panelists, and we'll respond to the questions during our Q&A session and in an FAQs document that will be posted on grants.gov. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on grants.gov or through grants.gov and through ORI's website. Today, we'll provide an overview of the funding opportunity announcement and competitive application requirements. Please note that the information provided in this webinar does not supersede any of the content of the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO for short. The NOFO is the written document that will govern the competition. We strongly encourage you to subscribe to the NOFO on grants.gov to ensure that if there are any revisions made to the NOFO, you will receive notice. And I would like to encourage all of you who are in attendance today to go back to grants.gov, subscribe to the NOFO, and look at the version that is currently there as well, because there has already been an update. Next slide, please. ORI's mission is to promote research integrity, ensure allegations of research misconduct are appropriately addressed, protect science and public health, and conserve public health service funds. Next slide, please. Core to ORI's mission is the development and implementation of education and outreach activities that aid PHS-funded research institutions and their efforts to teach the responsible conduct of research, promote research integrity, prevent research misconduct, and to respond effectively to allegations of research misconduct. ORI's Ensuring Research Integrity Conference Grant Program contributes to this mission by supporting conferences that advance the evolving field of research integrity and build the knowledge base in research misconduct, research integrity, and the prevention of research misconduct and detrimental research practices. Next slide. This notice solicits applications for projects to plan and implement conferences on research integrity and compliance with 42 CFR Part 93. In-person and virtual conferences will be considered for funding. Next slide. A total of up to $200,000 is available for up to 4 grant awards, with a project period of up to 1 year. Next slide. Conferences or workshops must be designed to provide a forum for discussion and to produce tangible outcomes related to at least one of the following themes: fostering an environment that promotes research integrity and the responsible conduct of research, prevention of research misconduct, effective handling of research misconduct allegations, or other topics linked to research integrity and compliance with 42 CFR Part 93. Next slide. The purpose of this initiative is to provide assistance for those concerned with research integrity to meet to discuss issues and topics related to promoting the responsible conduct of research, preventing research misconduct, and/or addressing issues that arise after an allegation of research misconduct is brought forward at an institution. Applicants should design their meeting to bring together experts from diverse areas of research, education, administration, law, and government to present their research findings, discuss effective tools, programs, and approaches, or to facilitate discussions that lead to the development or implementation of new tools, programs, or approaches. This is all in the effort to help prevent research misconduct and promote research integrity. Next slide, please. We expect the recipient to plan and implement a conference, assess conference outcomes, disseminate knowledge and materials resulting from the conference. And we'll take a closer look at each of these expectations on the upcoming slides. Next slide. ORI expects recipients to plan and implement a conference that provides a forum for discussion and produces tangible, measurable outcomes related to at least one of the following themes. And we've looked at these themes already: fostering an environment that promotes research integrity and the responsible conduct of research, prevention of research misconduct, effective handling of research misconduct allegations, or other topics linked to research integrity and compliance with 42 CFR Part 93. Tangible, measurable outcomes may include, but are not limited to, demonstrated retention of knowledge, sharing of knowledge gained, change in practice, or strategies that can be operationalized to improve research integrity practices. Next slide. ORI expects recipients to develop and implement a comprehensive evaluation strategy to assess conference outcomes. Recipients may assess outcomes through post-evaluation data or other appropriate means. Next slide. And when it comes to disseminating knowledge and materials resulting from the conference, ORI expects recipients to develop and implement a comprehensive time-framed dissemination plan to ensure that materials, products, and knowledge generated through the conference will be disseminated beyond the participants attending the event. Although we encourage publication in peer-reviewed journals, recipients should work to achieve broad, multi-channel, nationwide dissemination of the materials and key points resulting from the conference. And where relevant, recipients should develop materials that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. Next slide, please. The project narrative is the most important part of the application, since it will be used as the primary basis to determine whether your project merits an award. The project narrative should provide a clear, concise description of your project, and we recommend that it include the components that are listed here on the slide, as well as the requested information. So these components would include the project description, addressing innovation, outcomes, evaluation, dissemination, project management, and the environment and organizational capability. I'll briefly discuss each of these components on the upcoming slides, but ask you to please refer to the NOFO for the full details about these components. Next slide, please. Now, for the project description component, you should, next slide, explain the rationale for the proposed conference, define the gaps, needs, and/or issues on which the conference will focus. You also want to describe the scope and breadth of the gaps, needs, and/or issues, indicating if these are primarily national, so US domestic, or international issues. You also want to indicate how the proposed conference will contribute to addressing the identified gaps, needs, and issues. Next slide, please. You should also describe the nature of the activities to be undertaken and why these specific activities were selected. You'll want to present a clear connection between identified research integrity gaps, needs, or issues and the proposed activities. You'll also want to explain how these activities assist in achieving the overall goals and objectives of the project. You'll want to discuss potential problems, alternative strategies, and benchmarks for success that are anticipated to achieve these goals. You'll want to provide specifics about the proposed conference agenda, venue, speakers, attendees, and materials. Next slide, please. Additionally, applicants should include in the project description a description of the target audience and how you will advertise the conference and encourage attendance. You want to describe the extent to which technology will play a role if that is applicable. If a non-US location is proposed, justify the selection of that location. For example, we recommend you provide information such as an estimate of how many people may travel from the US to the conference for any role, and the connection to PHS-funded research researchers, or research institutions. Next slide, please. Now for the innovation component, you should, next slide, describe any novel approaches or methods you intend to employ to fulfill the conference's purpose. If you're utilizing approaches or methods that do not diverge substantially from existing practices, describe the novelty in the application of those methods to the topic or conference. Reference any existing approaches for the purpose of contrasting the novel approaches or methods you use. You should also describe how the conference will draw together appropriate experts who may otherwise not have the opportunity to convene. Next slide, please. For the outcomes component, you should keep the focus of this section on describing what outcomes the project will produce, and use the evaluation section to describe how you will assess the project outcomes. Next slide, please. You should specify the tangible, measurable outcomes that will result from your project. A tangible, measurable outcome is an observable end result that describes how an activity, event, resource, or approach helps the intended audience. It is large enough to be noticed. It demonstrates the impact of the activity, event, resource, or approach. And in addition to any discussion in the dissemination section, you should describe how you will report on the outcomes of the project. Next slide, please. For the evaluation component, you should describe the methods that you will use to assess and evaluate the impact of the project activities. You'll want to describe the quantitative and/or qualitative tools and techniques that you will employ to assess and evaluate the outcomes. And you will want to identify and document the lessons learned. Next slide, please. You should describe how you will evaluate knowledge retention and application of the knowledge gained, changes in attitudes, or other key outcomes that may or may not emerge prior to the conclusion of the conference. You'll want to describe how you will collect and report data and how you will ensure the validity and reliability of these data. Next slide, please. For the dissemination component, you should describe a comprehensive, time-framed dissemination plan to communicate key findings to stakeholders, the public, and/or others who might be interested in the results of the proposed project. You'll want to describe your strategies for broad multi-channel dissemination of key points and materials that emerge from conference events and activities. Next slide, please. And finally, you should describe the method you will use to disseminate the project's results and findings in a timely manner and in an easily understandable format to the PHS-funded research community, the public, or others who might be interested in using the results of the project to inform practice, program development, or policymaking. Next slide, please. Now, in the project management component, you should identify the principal investigator or project director, collaborators, and other researchers, including subrecipients, contractors, and consultants that are proposed for involvement in the project. This includes roles that research administrators, research integrity officers, research faculty, professional societies, publishers, editors, or others outside of your organization will engage in accomplishing the project. Please include a clear delineation of the roles and responsibilities for each contributor, their relevant expertise, and how they will contribute to achieving the project's goals and outcomes. It's helpful to identify the level of effort each individual is anticipated to provide in completing the programmatic activities. You'll also want to clearly identify the principal investigator or project director and describe this individual's qualifications. You should reference that individual's CV or resume in your appendices. We expect that throughout the period of performance, the PI or PD will be involved in and have substantial knowledge about all aspects of the project. Next slide, please. You should also specify who will have day-to-day responsibility for key tasks, such as leadership of the project, monitoring of the project's ongoing progress, preparation of reports, and communications with collaborators and HHS. And finally, you should describe the approach that you will use to monitor and track progress on the project's tasks and objectives. As appropriate, you should refer to the work plan that is included in your appendices. Next slide, please. For the final section of the project narrative, environment and organizational capability, you should describe the research or scientific environment of your organization and how it will contribute to the probability of success of the project. You'll want to describe how your organization is organized, such as the nature and scope of its work and the capabilities it possesses. You'll want to describe your organization's capability to successfully implement the proposed project. This should include a description of the institutional support, equipment, and other physical resources available to the principal investigator or project director and other project personnel. Next slide, please. You want to describe the organizational investment in the success of the principal investigator or project director and proposed project. Next slide. You should describe the capabilities of your organization that are not included elsewhere in the program narrative. If appropriate, include an organization chart in your appendices showing the relationship of the project to your organization. You'll also want to include information about any contractual or support staffs or organizations that have secondary roles in implementing the project towards achieving project goals. Describe collaborations in the application and accompanying letters of commitment. Next slide, please. You should describe the proposed in-person or virtual conference venue and articulate the characteristics or features of the venue that make it an appropriate setting for the conference activities. It's important to provide a contingency plan for modification of in-person meetings in the event of a resurgence of COVID-19 or other precautions related to other public health emergency conditions. Next slide, please. And finally, I'd like to point out that if there are a number of appendices, that should be submitted as an attachment. This includes the work plan, documentation of level of commitment, CVs, resumes, or biographical sketches for key project personnel, references cited, and description of facilities and resources available. All items described in this section will count toward the total page limit of your application. You must submit them as a single electronic file uploaded to the attachment section of your grants.gov application. So I am going to turn this over now to Mr. Dwayne Barlow from the OASH Office of Grants, Division of Grants and Acquisitions Management, who will now talk about the competitive application requirements and process. And just before Dwayne starts to talk, I see that some of you have put questions into the chat, and we're going to look at those and address the questions at the end all together. Take it away, Dwayne.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, submission dates and times for your application. Your application is due by 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, April the 11th on 2024. Your submission time will be determined by the date and time stamp provided by grants.gov when you complete your submission or the submission of your application. You're strongly encouraged to submit your application a minimum of 3 to 5 days prior to the application closing date. Grants.gov may take up to 48 hours to notify you of a successful submission. If you fail to submit your application by the due date and time, we won't be able to review it and it will not receive further consideration. Next slide, please. Okay, as for eligible applicants for this particular NOFO, applicant eligibility for this NOFO is as follows. Public or nonprofit universities, hospitals, laboratories, and other institutions are eligible to apply for an award under this announcement. Public or nonprofit faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, and American Indian, Alaska Native, Native American organizations are eligible to apply. Eligible entities include public or non-profit foreign organizations and foreign components of domestic organizations if the proposed activity provides a domestic benefit, such as promoting research integrity amongst PHS-funded institutions, both within the United States and abroad. Next slide, please. Cost sharing or matching for the project. So you're not required to provide cost share or matching in your proposed budget. Now, if you voluntarily include cost sharing in your application, you must include it in your budget narrative, or include in your budget narrative a non-federal sources justification as described in section H4, or your application will be disqualified. Voluntary cost sharing is not expected for research applications. During the merit review of an application, cost sharing will only be considered in the overall review of the adequacy of the total proposed budget, federal and non-federal share, to support the project proposed. Awarded applications including cost sharing or matching commitment, whether required or voluntary, will include the commitment on the notice of award at the level proposed in the application. Any change in the cost sharing or matching commitment will require prior approval of the grants management officer. Next slide, please. Application responsiveness criteria. So we'll review your application to determine whether it meets the responsiveness criteria below. If your application does not meet the responsiveness criteria, we will disqualify it from competition. We will not review it beyond the initial screening. Responsiveness criteria. The proposal abstract summary must clearly identify at least one of the following themes as the focus of the project: fostering an environment that promotes research integrity and the responsible conduct of research, prevention of research misconduct, effective handling of research misconduct and allegations, or other topics linked to research integrity and compliance with 42 CFR Part 93. Next slide, please. The Notice of Funding Opportunity Announcement, or the NOFO. The Notice of Funding Opportunity provides information and guidance related to your applications. Please read the entire funding announcement and follow the NOFO carefully. And keep in mind, as we stated before in this presentation, that the information provided in the NOFO takes precedence over any conflicting information in other documents, including this presentation. Next slide, please. Address to request application package. So you can obtain an application package electronically by accessing grants.gov at the URL that you see here, which is www.grants.gov. And you can find this particular NOFO by searching the assistance listing, formerly CFDA number, found on page 1 of the NOFO. The assistance listing, or the CFDA number, is 93.085. Please be sure to subscribe to the announcement in grants.gov so you receive notification of any updates to the NOFO or supporting documents. Next slide, please. Application submission. So OASH requires that all applications be submitted electronically via grants.gov unless an exemption has been granted by the grants management officer. If you submit an application via any other electronic communication, it will not be accepted for review. Keep in mind that grants.gov is a website portal, and all funding opportunities and grant application packages are made available on grants.gov. An application will not be considered valid until all application components are entered in grants.gov and received by OASH Grants and Acquisitions Management Division according to the deadlines specified in the submission dates and times section of the NOFO. You can contact grants.gov with any questions or concerns regarding the electronic application process. And if you want to give them a call, it's 1-800-518-4726. Next slide, please. So, application submission. The applications must be submitted as 3 files. So file 1 has to be the entire project narrative. File 2 is the entire budget narrative. including supporting documentation described in the budget narrative content section. And then file 3 should include all documents in the appendices section. Please note that required standard forms do not apply towards your page count limitations in the submission requirements as stated in the disqualification criteria. Next slide, please. Any files uploaded or attached to the grants.gov application must be of the following file formats. So you can use Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Adobe PDF, or any of the following image formats. So you can use JPEG, GIF, TIFF, or BMP only. Keep in mind that Microsoft Excel files will not be accepted. HHS.gov strongly recommends that electronic applications be uploaded as Adobe PDFs. If you convert to PDF prior to submission, you may prevent any unintentional formatting that might occur with submission of an editable document. Check your page count as far as your PDF and/or print your file to ensure that the document does not exceed the page limits. Next slide, please. Be complete with your application and do not leave blanks on forms unless the information is clearly not applicable. The individual submitting the application forms must have the legal authority to act on behalf of the organization. Next slide, please. To ensure successful submission of your application, please carefully follow the step-by-step instructions provided at www.grants.gov/web grants applicants apply for grants, or you can use that URL that you see here in blue. These instructions are kept up to date and also provide links to frequently asked questions and other troubleshooting information. Next slide, please. Okay, as for your application elements, so as far as forms, you want to have your application for federal assistance, so the SF-424. You want to have your budget information for non-construction programs, that's the SF-424A. Your disclosure of lobbying activities, which is the SFLLL, and your project abstract summary. So as far as files, for the project narrative, submit all your project narrative content as a single acceptable file. Budget narrative, submit all your budget narrative content as a single acceptable file. And appendices, submit all your appendix content as a single acceptable file in the attachment section of your grants.gov application. Next slide, please. Be sure to follow project narrative format instructions in the NOFO. Your application will be disqualified if it doesn't conform to the format requirements. You must double space the project narrative pages. You must use 12-point font. You should use an easily readable typeface such as Times New Roman or Arial. You may single space tables or use alternate fonts, but you must ensure that the tables are easy to read. For appendices and the budget narrative, you should use the same formatting specified for the project narrative. Appendix documents such as resumes may use alternate formats common to such documents. Next slide, please. Okay, so the system for award management, or SAM. So if you are registering a new entity in SAM.gov, you need to create a login.gov account if you don't already have one. If you are renewing your registration, your old SAM.gov username and password will not work anymore. You'll need to create a login.gov account if you don't already have one. Keep in mind that the minimum time frame to complete an initial SAM registration online is 30 minutes. The time frame for an applicant's registration to become active is up to 10 days and may take longer depending upon volume. Your SAM registration must be renewed each year. The average time frame for updates in SAM.gov to appear in grants.gov is up to 72 hours. Next slide, please. We strongly recommend that applicants check for an active registration in SAM well before the application deadline. If you are successful and you receive an award, you must maintain an active SAM registration with current information at all times during the active award. If you have not complied with the SAM registration requirements, HHS-OASH may determine that you're not qualified to receive an award and may use that determination as a basis for making an award to another applicant. Should you successfully compete and receive an award, all first-tier subaward recipients must have a UEI number at the time that you, the recipient, make a subaward to them. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Funding restrictions. If you're successful and you receive an award, by accepting the award, you agree that the award and any activities thereunder are subject to all provisions of 45 CFR Part 75 currently in effect or implemented during the period of award, other department regulations and policies in effect at the time of the award, and any applicable statutory provisions. Keep in mind that your costs must be allowable, allocable, reasonable, and necessary direct expenses or indirect costs in accordance with regulations and current policy. Indirect costs may be included per 45 CFR 75414. An applicant should indicate which method or rate is used for this application. Keep in mind that pre-award costs are not allowed. The current salary limitation is $212,100, and that was made effective January 2023. Next slide, please. Budget and narrative forms. Keep in mind that they must be consistent with the requirements of the NOFO. Budgeted costs must reflect proposed activities. Budget line item descriptions and justification requirements are explained in the NOFO. Suggested table formats are also included in the NOFO. And we have information for a plan for oversight of federal award funds in the NOFO as well. Keep in mind that forms, narrative, and detailed justifications do not count towards page limit. Next slide, please. Application disqualification. If your application does not meet the following requirements, it will be disqualified and receive no further consideration. So it has to be submitted electronically via grants.gov by the due date and time, unless an exemption was granted 2 business days prior to the deadline. If you successfully submit multiple applications for the same project, keep in mind that we'll only review the last application received by the deadline. OASH, HHS, GAM has to deem your application eligible. Your project narrative must be double-spaced on the equivalent of 8.5 by 11 page size with 1-inch margins on all sides and font size, not less than 12 points. The project narrative must not exceed 18 pages, and the total application, including project narrative, must not exceed 60 pages. Next slide, please. If your application, again, does not meet the following requirements, it will be disqualified and receive no further consideration. So your application must be in the English language and must be in terms of US dollars. Your federal funds requests, including indirect costs, should not exceed the maximum indicated in the award ceiling, and that award ceiling is $50,000. Your federal funds requests, including indirect costs, must not be below the minimum indicated in the award floor, and that award floor is $25,000. If you have included voluntary cost sharing or matching, you must include in your budget narrative a non-federal sources justification, and your application has to meet the application responsiveness criteria. Next slide, please. So with regard to application responsiveness criterion, the proposal abstract summary must clearly identify at least one of the following themes as the focus of the project. So again, it's fostering an environment that promotes research integrity and the responsible conduct of research, prevention of research misconduct, the effective handling of research misconduct allegations, or other topics linked to research integrity and compliance with 42 CFR Part 93. Next slide, please. Applications that lack the required supporting documentation or submit additional appendix files will not be disqualified from competitive review. However, this may impact your application's rating under the evaluation criteria, so please be sure to follow submission instructions per the NOFO carefully. Next slide, please. Okay, with regard to your application review criteria, we have 3 equally rated criteria that we're going to look at. It's the project description and innovation, outcomes, evaluation, and dissemination, and then project management, environment, and organizational capability. Next slide, please. Application merit review. So eligible applications will be evaluated, commented on, and rated by a panel of independent reviewers with technical expertise in the applicable fields according to criteria listed in the NOFO. The merit review panel process is formal and confidential. Federal staff are available for questions and to ensure that the process is consistent and fair, but do not participate in the discussion and scoring. Applications are then also reviewed by GAM staff or the grant staff for administrative and business compliance, and then by ORI, program office staff for programmatic compliance. Next slide, please. So with regard to funding decisions, the director of the Office of Research Integrity will provide recommendations for funding to the grants management officer for risk analysis. Upon completion of risk analysis and concurrence of the grants management officer, HHS-OASH will then issue notices of award. Keep in mind that no award decision is final until a notice of award is issued. And all award decisions, including the level of funding, if an award is made, are final and you may not appeal. Next slide, please. Keep in mind that we're not obligated to make any federal award as a result of this announcement. Only the grants officer can bind the federal government to the expenditure of funds. If you receive communications to negotiate an award or request additional or clarifying information, this does not mean that you will receive an award. It only means that your application is still under consideration. All award decisions, including level of funding, if an award is made, are final and you may not appeal. Next slide, please. So the funding process as it relates to review of risk posed by applicants. So HHS-OASH will evaluate each application in the fundable range for risk posed by the applicant before issuing an award in accordance with 45 CFR 75.205. OASH will use a risk-based approach and may consider any of the items such as the following related to, or as stated in the NOFO. So we'll take a look at the applicant's financial stability, the quality of management systems, and the ability to meet the management standards as prescribed in 45 CFR Part 75. We'll take a look at the applicant's history of performance, reports and findings from audits performed, and the applicant's ability to effectively implement statutory, regulatory, or other requirements imposed on non-federal entities. Next slide, please. The plan for oversight of federal award funds. If your internal controls are available online, you may provide the link as a part of your plan in the budget narrative. We have also included supplementary information in section H.5, which contains questions applicants may find useful in considering their recipient plans for oversight of federal funds. Next slide, please. Risk review resulting in non-funded determination. If we determine your organization does not meet either or both of the minimum qualification standards as described in 45 CFR 75.205A2, and we do not make an award to you as a result, we must report that determination to FAPIS if certain conditions apply. Keep in mind that the information reported in FAPIS is available for other organizations to review when considering you for other awards. Next slide, please. Okay, now the notice of award. So the notice of award at the end of the competition notifies the successful applicant of the selection, the award amount, project, and budget periods. It includes any conditions on the award, in other words, requirements that must be met as a condition of receiving grant funds. And it includes all your standard terms, reporting requirements, and contact information for OASH GAM or the grants office and the program office. Next slide, please. Points of contact during the funding process. Keep in mind that the grants office is the official contact for awardees throughout the award lifecycle. All official communication related to the award is between the grants office and the successful applicant. Unsuccessful applicants will be notified by the program office via letter. Next slide, please. All right. At this portion, we want to provide you some summary and tips. With regard to the project narrative description, try to be clear, complete, and concise in the project description. Follow and address exactly what is requested in the NOFO. Don't make the reviewer search for the required information. Generally, the easier the application is to review, the better the rating. Reviewers are not allowed to do external research or follow embedded links and things like that. Clearly identify the sections of the applications and indicate which component is being addressed. Project narrative must include all required information within the page limit. Do not use appendices to expand the page limit. Next slide, please. Make your goals and objectives SMART, that is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time frame. Activities presented in a work plan should relate directly to the proposed goals and objectives. The program work plan, the evaluation plan, and the budget should provide a complete picture of how the applicant will address the needs as well as address the purpose and expectations for the project in the NOFO. Next slide, please. With regard to staffing, your staffing should be appropriate and reasonable for the goals, objectives, and activities of the proposed project. You want to be complete in describing what the staff will do, the expertise required, and the percent time they will be assigned to the project. Next slide, please. For your budget should include adequate funds to carry out the proposed work plan, the evaluation plan, and administrative responsibilities of the project. The budget should be reasonable and relate directly to the goals and objectives of the project. Do not request more funds than are available as listed in the NOFO. This amount is inclusive of indirect costs. The operating budget should be complete and include federal and non-federal funds, projected program income from fees and third-party payers and other contributing funds. Next slide, please. Overall, we encourage you to use individuals' first names, first, middle, and last, to distinguish them for verification in the SAM exclusion records. Electronic submission is required. Please don't wait until the last minute to begin SAM registration or update your registration. You don't want to wait till the last minute to begin your electronic submission because problems can and do arise. Next slide, please. If you receive an award, keep in mind, only one project or principal investigator will be named on the award documents. So we need you to clearly identify the individual to be the PDPI on your application. We typically expect this to be the person named on the SF424 inbox 8F. Please do not use a placeholder or honorary PDPI because this does not present an accurate picture about who will be responsible for the day-to-day management of your project. If you have not hired an individual to be the PDPI, you should name an interim PDPI and clearly identify that person as such. If you receive an award, a request for change in the PDPI or key personnel under any circumstance requires prior approval of the grants management officer before becoming effective. Next slide, please. So if you have questions after or while you're reading through your NOFO, you can reach out for program questions to Dr. William Campbell. His email information and telephone information are right there on the screen. If you have administrative, or financial questions, you can reach out to me. My email address as well as my telephone number is there on the screen for you to take a look at and use as appropriate. If you have electronic submission requirements or if you need grants.gov applicant support, you can go directly to the website at grants.gov, or you can email at support@grants.gov, or again, as we mentioned this telephone number earlier, you can reach out to them at 1-800-518-4726. We want to remind you here to please do not contact the program office or the grants office staff for grants.gov issues because we don't manage that site. Next slide, please. So that's what I have for you guys today in reference to the application components. And now we want to turn it back over to Karen so we can have a question and answer session. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dwayne. And we do have a few questions that have been submitted to us. Before I get to those, a couple of reminders. that we are going to use a few minutes here to address your questions that have been submitted and any others that might come in while we're chatting. And that these questions will be turned into an FAQ document, which will be posted to grants.gov. Along with that FAQ document, we will also be posting the slides as well as a link to the video of this webinar. And I wanted to thank you, Dwayne, for mentioning where the PDPI name should be included on the SF 424, because I know each year we have a problem with our kickoff meetings where the PD or the PI was not appropriately included and their account is not appropriately set up. So it's absolutely critical to include the PDPI's name in the right place on the SF 424. So looking at a few of the questions that we have here so far, one of them is about whether or not a non-US entity, such as a higher education institution, might apply for this NOFO. And so for that, I'm going to reference you back to Dwayne's discussion of the eligibility that for applicants. And one of the things that he mentioned and is found on page 8 of the NOFO under eligibility information is that public or nonprofit universities are eligible to apply. And additionally, that public and nonprofit foreign organizations are also eligible to apply. So I would encourage you to take a look at the eligibility information on page 8 of the NOFO under section C1 to make sure that that applies to your institution. We also had a couple of other questions, one related to whether or not these conference awards or the conference opportunity has made awards in the past. And yes, it has. We had 2 awards under the conference grant opportunity last year, and then there have been several others over the years as well. Some of that information is available on our website. Let's see, what else do we have? We have a question about whether or not it's expected a symposium will include more than one institution. You know, I'm going to refer to you again to the NOFO where it talks about the intent of this and the expectations under the project narrative, and whether or not the type of symposium that you are envisioning or planning would fall under those criteria. And so there, you know, we're really looking to make sure that anything that might be funded through this opportunity meets those expectations. Dwayne, there's one in the chat about travel and housing cost for speakers and whether that can be supported.
Let me say that the way that we would approach that in reviewing an application is that we made a couple mentions to it over the course of this particular presentation, but we're governed by the grants office is governed by 45 CFR 75. In particular, we're going to look at subpart E, which is it makes mention of cost principles. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at what the uniform guidance allows us to allow you to pay for with regard to those particular areas, and we'll make those decisions there. So you can refer to 45 CFR 75, and it has a specific section. And if you'll give me a second, I will give you the exact site that you can go there, and it outlines. It's actually 45 CFR 75 432, and it provides provisions for conferences. So you can look at that section, and that will govern how we'll make decisions about what is an allowable cost.
Thank you, Dwayne. We have a couple of additional questions. One's related to the length of the project narrative. The project narrative itself is 18 pages, with the overall application not exceeding a total of 60 pages. And I think that is all of the questions we currently have. We'll hold on for another couple minutes to see if anybody has any additional. Oh, the slide said 16 pages. All right, let me just check that slide. It again is, I think, an example of why it is always good to check the NOFO, and what is in the NOFO is what will govern the application process and what is reviewed for when the applications are submitted. And I can give you the page number of the NOFO where that is. So the page limits are noted on page 10 of the NOFO under application disqualification criteria. And so there's where it sets the limit of not exceeding the 18-page limit for the project narrative. Let's see. There's a question about are there restrictions on which institutions I imagine the applicant institution can collaborate with? You know, I think that's one we're going to want to look at a little bit further so that we don't inappropriately advise you. But I think it's always appropriate to refer to the eligibility criteria listed in the notice of funding opportunity to consider again those expectations that are expressed in the NOFO, and to make sure that anyone you're collaborating with aligns with that. You know, any other criteria that would be eligibility or disqualifying, it's also important to consider those as well. I'm not seeing any additional. Oh, there's one. Oh, thank you, Dwayne. Dwayne was able to put his eyes on that slide quicker than I could. So thank you. Are there any additional questions? Otherwise, I think we'll thank you all for attending today and your interest in our funding opportunity, and wish you the best of luck should you start to develop a project and submit an application. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon and weekend.